Hood is back. Like all Jack-in-the-Greens, is a nuisance, and several times moved into the ridge zone around the Hogback Glade. He shot at me, and this is becoming a cause of great concern, but I cannot enrich the oak vortex sufficiently with the pre-Mythago of the Urskamug. What is the answer? To try to enter more deeply, to find the wildwoods. Perhaps the memory is too far gone, too deep in the silent zones of the brain now, to touch the trees. Mythago Wood is a novel by Robert Holdstock, published in 1985. The plot concerns the experiences of a family living next to an ancient woodland that contains a very strange power. This book changed the way I look at woodland forever. It also changed the way I understood and related to myth and storytelling. It begins just after World War II, when the protagonist, Stephen Huxley, returns to his family home in rural Herefordshire in England after recovering from his war wounds in France. His father has died in his absence, and as his mother died years before, there is only his older brother Christian living in the old place. Stephen is told that his father, a kind of researcher who had for years been exploring and mapping the primeval Ryhope Wood that borders the family estate, had become increasingly obsessed with the strange nature of this woodland, and because of this had gone gradually insane before his death through illness. Christian too seems to know something about Ryhope Wood, but will not tell Stephen directly. Instead, he directs him to their father's journals, an excerpt I quoted above. As Stephen reads them and decrypts the strangeness of the text, he also begins to understand some of what is happening. Stephen notes how different his brother has become in his absence, and Christian begins acting much like their father had done before him, becoming obsessed with finding something deep in the woodland and venturing into the dark tangles beneath the trees for longer and longer periods. The woodland is deeply mysterious, manifesting bizarre phenomena, and yet is strangely alluring. Despite himself, Stephen also begins to fall under its spell. Eventually he must set off on a quest of his own, into the deep woodland, into history, and into myth itself. Holdstock writes the nature of woodland better than anyone else. It is powerful, even awe-inspiring and terrifying. As you read, you are enveloped in the smell of its wet earth, of fungus, the crawling of beetles in rotting logs, the living, decomposing leaf litter underfoot, the thorns and tangles of the undergrowth, and the imposing trunks and suffocating canopy. As writer Michael Moorcock said, no other author has so successfully captured the magic of the wild wood. Quote, "Sometimes the deciduous woodland thinned, and the undergrowth grew too dense for us to move through it, so that we had to skirt the impenetrable tangle, striving to keep our sense of direction. In such expansive thickets we saw corrupted thatch, wicker and daub walls, sometimes the heavy posts or stone pillars of cultures unrecognisable from these remains. We peered into one well-hidden glade and saw canvas and hide canopies, the remains of a fire, the piled bones of deer and sheep, an encampment in the dark forest, and from the sharp smell of ash on the air, a place still used." End quote. As Stephen ventures into the woodland, he leaves 20th century England behind. He encounters mythological figures made manifest, made into flesh and bone, each one living out its own mythic story, its archetypal role in its own story. These are figures from British history, but especially those manifested at times of great suffering in the land. They are folk heroes, brought to life through the collective will of the population, ancient Britons fighting the Roman occupation, or the coming of the Saxons, Anglo-Saxon heroes resisting the Normans, princesses, warriors, wandering heroes from the Paleolithic and Neolithic all the way through our history, even to the lost Tommy figure, a myth manifested from the trenches of World War I. Stephen also discovers mythic locations, mythic structures, even entire mythic landscapes, conjured from the collective unconscious, from the minds of our ancestors. The lost Iron Age Broch, the glorious fantastical medieval castle, the Roman villa falling to ruin, the frozen plains of an endless ice age, and so on. Deep in the woodland, time itself warps into myth time, the stories that are untethered from our calendars that cannot be pinpointed to a specific year, and instead repeat forever in endless cycles as they are told and retold. Mythago Wood is about myth and folklore, the nature of myth itself. What has been its role within the societies of the past? How do the stories pass on down through the ages? And while the details and context continue to evolve, what are the essentials in these stories that stay the same, and why do they? What are the connections between the people and their land, and why are they important? The land shaping the people shaping the land and the people shaping the myths that encompass both, and the myths shaping the people through the generations. As Stephen ventures ever deeper into the woodland, he is also travelling deeper into his own mind. There are obvious Jungian interpretations of this novel, as well as psychoanalytical ones, as Stephen is pursued by the terrifying presence of his father, manifested in the enormous, monstrous body of a Paleolithic or Mesolithic man-boar. But that's not especially interesting to me. What fascinates me is the way Stephen becomes ever more mythological himself. As he discovers more about the nature of the woodland, its peoples and its landscapes, he becomes ever more entangled in the mythological world. He changes the myths, and they change him. As we hear the stories of our people, our folklore and myth, we see ourselves and our actions reflected in them. We cannot do otherwise because all myths are true, not literally but metaphysically. They would not have survived and been passed on otherwise. There are real historical figures whose lives have become indistinguishable from myth. This is because of the nature of stories, but also because real people, consciously or unconsciously, will reflect the lives of mythological figures, and real events will reflect ancient myths. Brothers killing brothers, glorious kings brought down by treachery or jealousy, and the actions of real people can be so powerful that they change the ancient stories forever, twisting them into new forms. And in this story, Stephen's narrative, his life, his actions and choices become mythic. His story slips into a groove of 1,000 tales told before his, of a brother seeking revenge on the kinsman who wronged him, of a lover pursuing the woman who was stolen from him, an outsider whose coming brings change, a warrior destined to bring balance back to the world, and so on. There's more to this realm than Robin Hood and the Twigling. There's more to legend than heroes. Do you know what's beyond the fire? Do you know what's through there? With great difficulty, he used his sword to point behind him. They call it Lavondis. Mythago Wood is one of those books that permanently changed the way I look at the world. Not least, it awakened the magic of the woodland of Britain. Even the overmanaged places we have today have a different sort of feeling to them now. It also brought into sharp relief the traditions, the folklore and myth that continue to thrive in my culture today. But more than this, it changed the way I look at stories, the nature of stories, forever. Holdstock quotes the composer Ralph Vaughan Williams, who was talking about his discovery of folk music as perfectly describing the way Holdstock discovered folklore. Quote, "I had that sense of recognition. Here was something which I had known all my life, only I didn't know it." End quote.